Hello, welcome to the channel. Today what we're going to talk about is the future of integration and does it include AI agents? Alright, so why this episode? So I recently presented at the Connected 25 event, so this was virtually, and it was hosted by Cubic in Berlin. So thanks for hosting me and having me present as part of your event. Now, the session that I did do was about roadmap, and as part of the roadmap, I did want to talk about the role of agents and how we're thinking about them. And I think there is a strong linkage between AI agents and integration. And I see the evolution of integration really being agents, or agents being a big part of it. So this presentation, kind of think of it as a bit of a thought experiment. I try to compare and contrast sort of your traditional integration project activities and implementation, and then sort of try to project how that might look using AI agents. Now, AI agents is naturally sort of this kind of ambiguous concept, and just to help ground, I've come up with sort of a definition. This is at least a definition that we do use internally from time to time. So an agent is given a set of skills, and when we say skills, think of it as tools, provide an objective or goal, and have that agentic workflow determine how to solve that particular problem without specific step-by-step instructions. And this is kind of key. Like when we talk about traditional integration projects, we talk about there being sort of a predefined set of steps that needs to happen in order for something to take place. Now, if we think about agents, at the end of the day, they're trying to solve an objective or a goal. Same thing with integration. But the difference is that there is sort of this human intelligence that is included in this capability or component that will help us dynamically determine the set of steps that need to be accomplished, and can go ahead and do that in the order that it sort of determines to be best. Now, this ultimately leads to a lot of flexibility, and I think this is really where the opportunity comes. When we talk about integration, usually everything is very deterministic, and that is so that you have consistency, because you do not want to have sort of exceptions in your process or variances. Now with agents, because we have this additional intelligence available to us, we naturally then have more room for flexibility, because we can interpret what is the next best action to do, and provided that tool is available to us, or skills, we can then go ahead and execute that. So I think the video is probably about 17-18 minutes long. Please give it a listen, and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thanks. Let's now talk about the future of integration, and this is centered around agents. And so we hear a lot about agents these days, and I think there's a strong linkage between agents and integration. If anything, I would kind of look at the evolution of integration as agents. And so sometimes people say like, well, you know, what is an agent? And hopefully through the course of this segment, we'll get you there. So let's start to take a look at sort of a traditional integration approach. And then the goal is to get you to a point where you can see the value of how using an agentic approach can actually make integration even better. So if we think about a typical integration or automation project, we have a lot of rules, like business rules, and we have them for good reason. We want a very deterministic execution. We don't want a lot of random things happening, because random things means exceptions. Exceptions mean downtime. It also means lack of productivity, because someone now has to go manually fix things typically, and that's not good for anyone. So what do we usually do? We usually have these predefined scenarios. We'll have these use cases, right, where we go ahead and document, like, this is this particular use case, this flow of information. Step 1 is this, step 2 is this, step 3 is this, step 4 is this, and we kind of can start to build that predictability around it. And I think that's great. Integration and automation has provided tremendous value to organizations, because we've been able to go ahead and consistently go ahead and integrate different systems and remove the work that ordinarily would be people on a keyboard making keystrokes into these different systems. But it's kind of, you know, the trade-off becomes, well, what happens if something goes out of those predefined paths? And so that's where integration is kind of like a train. And I don't mean this in a negative context. I like trains. I'd rather be on a train than a plane. But trains are very predictable when you think about the path, right? You're on a set of rails. And generally speaking, there's nowhere for you to go but to stay on the rails. And I think traditional integration is very much aligned to that analogy. How many times when you've been in your projects have you had a business process exception path? How many times have you said, oh, what about this? Oh, what about that? And then what ends up happening, you have this like tight scope, you've got expectations on dates, and then the business goes, oh, we'll handle that manually, right? And so it's like, then what do you do, right? So the question is, why did you have this exception path? What is sort of some of the reasons for that? Sometimes it's due to cost. I just talked about how it can be due to schedule, but it also can be related to complexity. If something, oh, that's too complex, if we have to sort of code all of that, there's too many rules. Like we'll just offload that to another queue and a human will pick that up and go ahead and perform that work. Now, oftentimes a human might need to make a judgment call. Now, how does that human make that judgment call? So in the event of an exception, what are they typically doing? There's probably some document that the business has gone ahead and sort of authored that dictates sort of what we do in this situation. Or there could be this policy guide, kind of depending on the complexity. Think about being in a contact center, right? You've got these books. There could be several chapters in that book. And it's more of like, now how do we go ahead and do it? Now, I'd say and sometimes this does make sense, but also where does this start to become a bigger problem? So the more and more of these sort of exception processes, it leads to more and more inefficiencies. And the changes to a business process requires a substantial amount of rework, especially as you think about sort of new requirements, right? And then so you might sort of defer these and say, oh, here's a new scenario, we're going to keep that manual. And then because the problem is that these incremental business cases might be difficult, but what they end up doing is accruing to a larger debt. At some point, you run the risk of having more manual process than you do have automated processes, and then the business doesn't understand which is where, and what they can do is just abandon it and say, you know what, we're not even going to use this integration anymore, and we're going to go ahead and just do it manually. And I think we've probably all seen samples of that where everyone had great intentions initially about this interface being built, but over time the value has been eroded, and then it becomes a matter of like, oh, it's just easier if we just go ahead and do this manually. So you end up having kind of too many holes in the boat, to use that analogy. So the question becomes, how do we avoid this kind of this, it's the house that has been remodeled and remodeled and remodeled and remodeled and added to that doesn't actually work that well at the end of the day. And how do we go ahead and achieve looks of something a little bit more like this? And so what it really comes down to is this flexibility. And I think that's where agents will go ahead and shine. Now, at the end of the day, like when we talk about agents, it starts with the business. It doesn't start with technology. And what it does is it starts with objectives and goals being defined. So with this particular business process, what are we trying to solve, right? And outline parameters that dictate how we go ahead and solve that. Now, once you understand the parameters that sort of drives the process itself and what the process should do and what the process shouldn't do, that's where you go ahead and establish these different guardrails where we define what are certain thresholds. So let's think about perhaps a product return scenario. There might be different parameters that dictates the behavior. If it's less than this value, we do this. If it's a person has returned something too many times, we do this, right? So this is where you can start to govern those rules. And those documents that we talked about, those policy documents, those actually can be ingested into a large language model that makes that efficiently. No longer are we coding 1,000 if-then-else statements in order to define those rules. So as part of defining what the rules are, we can also explicitly say what can't happen. And then it becomes a question of like, okay, great. Now that this is in place, how do we go ahead and test them? So this is where prompts come in. And so what you see here on the screen is a logic app that is dealing with that particular product return scenario that I was talking about. In this case, coffee. So where we're giving a prompt, and what we're saying is these are the instructions and these are the rules that dictate a particular product return. So in this case, if they've returned it less than 4 times over a 6-month period, check mark. If they're outside of that bounds, that then takes us down a different path. And so that's where the prompts come in, and you include these prompts as part of the Azure OpenAI connector, and then you can actually use the large language model to go ahead and help you define or determine what is sort of the next step that should take place. And so this allows you to not only ingest your own data into the LLM, where you've got very customer-specific or organization-specific business rules, or you can use a generally trained model if your topic is just more general in nature, such as like, hey, I'm getting an image, what is this image of? Like that might be something where a generally available model could help you in that regard. So the question becomes, and this is kind of the secret sauce or the magic, if you will, is that a large language model that understands context can intelligently assemble a plan of action that provides customers with this flexibility over very rigid business processes. Because before, remember, I talked about what do we do when we've got these exception processes? Oh, we now go get the human, right? And then we get out the policy book. Well, what happens if we take the policy book and ingest it into the large language model? It can then help direct traffic, if you will, from that perspective. Now, the question is great. Okay, so we've got a large language model, we've got these policies, we've got the business rules that are there. The question is great, now what do I do, right? Now, this is where tools come into place. And kind of think of it this way, right? So we've got some screwdrivers, and then we've got some bits that you would sort of use in one of those screwdrivers that are more adaptable. Kind of think of it like this, right? If we think about traditional integration, it could be the screwdriver. And there's nothing wrong with that. Screwdriver, for that specific task drives a lot of value. Now, the question becomes, what happens if you run into a screw that isn't of this type? In this case, Phillips. Right? What if we have a square? Or what if we have a flathead? Right? Then the question, this doesn't provide us a whole lot of good, does it? But having this assembly of tools that we can dynamically plug in to our architecture drives a tremendous amount of value. And think of this as your agent and sort of the opportunities. Now, what are some of the tools that exist in Azure Logic Apps? I think the first tool is a workflow, right? So we can now go ahead and assemble reusable packages of integration actions that solve a specific task. Now, the one could be like update this ticket, right? That could be a workflow with a few different steps that need to be performed in order to update that ticket. That becomes a tool that we now make available to the agent as a way to go ahead and leverage. Connectors, huge tool, right? Over 1,400 different connectors that we can go ahead and use. So this is what allows you to unlock the different line of business systems and enterprise data. Now, this is actually amazing. And this is something, I wish we could show it to you today, but I think this is going to be will blow your mind the first time you do see this. So if you go ahead and look at a lot of these agentic frameworks like Semantic Kernel, and you're building out what they call like a kernel function, it's a function that gets dynamically called. And that function could have different inputs. It's got like a string, it's got an integer, it's got a date. Those are all things that you go ahead and describe. Because when you describe it, the model can then understand, hey, this is what I need to do. I need to turn on the lights. And then there's this function that says, oh, I can turn on the lights, but these are the inputs that I need to go do that. OpenAPI metadata helps with this dynamic calling. So if you think about today, once again, everything is predefined. We drag a connector onto our workflow. We have all of these inputs that we have to manually go ahead and populate. Think about that happening from a dynamic perspective, where the model knows, hey, I need to go turn on this light. And hey, this particular workflow or this particular connector has these inputs that I must go ahead and provide. So then the model can dynamically go ahead and fetch those values as a way before it actually dynamically gets called. I know it's probably a little bit hard to explain, but trust me, when you see this for the first time, it'll blow your mind. Audit is another thing, right? One of the big concerns with AI is like, what is happening? How do I know this did what it was supposed to do? Well,
from a technical perspective, run history tells you exactly what happened, right? So we can see inputs, outputs, execution times, exactly what we would expect when we're building our workflows in Logic Apps. It also allows those operational analysts to follow those breadcrumbs so we can see exactly the steps that particular agent took as it executed that business process. Now, the next question is more around what about the business? They want to have some visibility into basically the health of their business process, but ideally also the benefit that business process is actually providing. So this is where we go ahead and we build out that business process. We can see exactly the path that business process went down. We can see when there's any sort of exceptions. We can see when, say, AI is responsible for making a decision, what was the inputs, what was the decision, what were the outputs, and we can see everything and make that very transparent to our business. Now, the next thing you can also do, and that's where we see on the right-hand side, is this is a Power BI dashboard that is leveraging the underlying business process tracking data. And what we can now do is build these experiences. So if we think about in the past where we might have this sort of human in the loop situation, which we're going to talk about on the next slide, is this might be the path that AI is taking care of. There might be still some paths that we need to loop a human in. We can now start to track that. And if we start to associate value for when AI did that, now we can have that ROI. So when someone asks you, what was the ROI of using an agent? Now we can start to say, well, here it is. Because it's every time it runs, this gets updated. And obviously, if you get a situation where it's hey, why do we still have so many manual processes? Now we can measure it. And then over time, we can now see progress as we try to go ahead and achieve more savings and productivity for the organization. Beyond sort of that traceability, we also have enterprise readiness. There's a lot of these new agentic frameworks that are out there, a lot of very innovative companies, but they are newer. They may not have sort of the battle-tested sort of experiences that we do as Azure, right? We've got global scale, we're reliable, we're scalable, and we're secure. And then when we get to situations where, hey, AI, it's out of bounds, right? We talked about those rules. We do want to loop in a human. And this is where we can go ahead and take advantage of Microsoft Teams connector and adaptive cards that basically allows us to loop in a human, provide the information that they need in order to make a particular decision, and then they can direct the next course of action. Now, what's also interesting with this is that, even though we're halting the process for oversight, once we still have the human, we have their perspective, we can still automate what their decision is. They might say, you know what, in this case, it's we're going to go ahead and accept the product return, and then we'll go ahead and automate those last steps. Or we might reject that particular return, and we can automate those steps. But we're still getting the human to provide that oversight to make sure that the business has the right outcome. So when we talk about outcomes and we talk about agents, I think what we're ultimately looking for is agility, right? That's more from the technical perspective. How do we avoid having to hard code all of these different paths? But then also, how do we, provide more productivity by perhaps not having as many of those manual exception processes and having more of these as baked into the solution itself? Because whenever we go ahead and abandon an integration or continue to have manual processes, we lose productivity. And in using this AI agent approach allows for you to loosely couple approaches is to solve business process automation. Now, you might be asking, well, is agents a product at this point? I would say you can kind of think of it as a design pattern. We can implement agentic workflows in Logic Apps today. And I'd say where we're focused on is how do we sort of make these experiences even better inside of Logic Apps? And naturally, Microsoft is making investments across the board. We will also continue to integrate with other agentic frameworks and platforms inside of Microsoft, just really giving customers sort of the best experience to meet their needs. Now, you might be watching all of this and go, okay, as an integration developer, what's my role in all of this? And you still have a huge role in all of this, right? This is where understanding some of the latest LLM, the large language models, is really important. Understanding prompts is still very important, but also these building blocks, right? Building those workflows, building those connectors, building that traceability experience. Tons of things for integration developers to do. So this isn't something that you should be threatened by. I think this is more of just like, how do we even take it to the next step and provide even more value to the business? So in terms of calls to action, we've seen a lot of computing trends come and go, but I don't think we've seen, at least in my career, anything as powerful as AI. And I think when we look back at some of the previous trends about, like, say, mobile or even cloud, right, there was always these varying degrees of investment from vendors in basically the industry. I think every vendor is looking at AI. I think that speaks to the potential of it. Maybe, is it ready for everyone today? Perhaps not. But I would say if you look at like where all of the money is going, all of the investment is going, this is real. Companies are reshaping themselves. And I do think, the best time to learn AI was yesterday. The next best time is today. So go explore. And what I will do is leave you with some resources that you can use to go ahead and find out more information. What we do have here is our Logic Apps Live. It's a monthly webinar. It's on the fourth Thursday of the month. We host it on YouTube. It's recorded. It's available on demand. And you can go ahead and catch up on the latest Logic App news. The other thing is we have our AIS tech community blog. Any of our product announcements, they show up there. Go ahead and visit that. Subscribe to the blog. We do provide a monthly newsletter on that blog as well, where we summarize all of the great work that's happening inside of Microsoft and also in our community. And this is a great opportunity for you to go ahead and learn more. So with that, I just want to thank you for the opportunity to share my presentation with you. Hopefully this was interesting for you, and feel free to reach out over LinkedIn. It'd be great to connect with you. Thanks again, and take care.